Right, now in this section we are going to have a look at the consequence of the fall on Adam's work. And I'm going to start by reading a short passage from Genesis 3, which really clearly highlights what it is that happened as a result of Adam's rebellion and failure to really bring godly guardianship to his family. And it really, sometimes it amazes me that we miss so much in the Bible. You know, this is kind of an aside, but there is a tendency not to see things when our theology or our doctrine or ideas don't actually give us room to see them. Because we always read with filters. We read with glasses on. And I've read this passage many, many times, but never really cottoned on to the fact that it's not work that's cursed, but it's the ground. So let me read it to you and listen out, and you will see quite clearly what God is saying here. Then to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, now I'm not going to preach on that, and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying you should not eat from it, cursed is the ground because of you. Right? In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So here we have then a very clear statement from God, a judgment, if you like, which it is, over Adam because he did not take his responsibility that God had given him in chapter 2 to be a guardian and to keep this garden. He had not taken that seriously, and he had compromised and listened to the beguiling words of his wife, but also primarily of the enemy. So in chapter 3 then we see that God says that it's not, the thing that is cursed is not so much his work, and that is, therefore work isn't the result of the fall, because work came beforehand. But the thing that is cursed is the ground. And there are a number of consequences that God says about this curse on the ground that had a direct impact upon Adam's life. Now let's remember that in chapter 2, when he is told to cultivate this garden, that it was being watered, the ground was cooperative, the fruit was coming very much more easily, and therefore there was less endeavor, less labor to bring forth the crops that Adam was promised. And the trees were productive, they were cooperative. All of nature was working together to reveal the glory of God. So there was a flowing, a harmony, and there was a cooperation between all the various actors and players within the garden. But suddenly now you get a consequence, you get a curse coming in, a judgment, and there is resistance. So whereas before the ground had cooperated, now there is a resistance to the efforts that Adam is putting in. And so we see threefold consequence on Adam and on his work, which I will then now discuss with you. First of all, the work became more difficult. There was toil, hard labor involved. And for Adam, the ground not only produced a crop through the sweat of his brow. So work became considerably more onerous. And that is still the world in which we live today. People try and escape it, they try and get rid of it, they try and avoid it, and still have enough money. But really, when they engage with it, it becomes more difficult. It doesn't cooperate. Sometimes it just doesn't flow. You have days where you feel like you spent the entire day trying to work one simple thing out and it hasn't really fallen into place. Or you've had numerous distractions. So you set out an agenda for your day and then suddenly all kinds of things happen that take you in a completely different direction, and you don't get to accomplish the things that you wanted to do originally. So the first aspect of the fall then is that work became more difficult for Adam, and there was a toil involved and hard labor. Secondly, it's for all his life. There's no promise of retirement for Adam. You know? We live in a day where we have some privileges over Adam. We're trying to get around some of the curses of the fall. But actually work is a blessing when we understand it. So, but it was for all his life, and it was unending. The blessings of fruitfulness ended. So Adam had to continue to work until he died. He had to continue to cultivate that field. He had to continue to look after his flocks. He had to continue to maintain the things that God had given, were required in order to be able to produce the food and the things that they needed for their household. Thirdly, there was active resistance from the soil. And that meant that thorns and thistles grew up. There was competition for the nutrients and for the water in the ground. And how many of you know you don't need to plant weeds to have them grow in your garden? You know, it's not as if you need to go to the garden center or the nursery and, stock up on weeds so you've got something to pull up. They seem to automatically know how to grow, regardless of how many you've pulled up already. So you may have been in that garden for best part of 30 years, but you're still pulling up the same sorts of weeds because they just know how to grow everywhere, all the time, don't they? And those are competition for the crops you're trying to grow. They compete for its moisture, they compete for the nutrients in the soil, they can compete for light, as Jesus talked about when he shared the parable of the sower and the seed, or the soils. And some seed was sown amongst what? Thorns and thistles. So they grew up and they took the light from the wheat that was growing. So there was active resistance from the soil, thorns and thistles grew up, and this required removal of the obstacles and those difficulties in order to be able to grow the kind of crops that Adam was seeking. And those are the consequences that we all live with today. And so creation now was in opposition to Adam because he had rebelled against God. It was in opposition. Adam had this curse upon him now, this judgment in his relationship to the ground, because he had rebelled against God, and he was cut off from the grace and the presence of God. So now he no longer has the favor, the blessing of God flowing through his life into the ground and into the things that he's doing. Now that's why, as Christians, we should expect and trust God to give us a completely different capacity than our neighbors who are not Christians in our same job environment, because we're now connected up again with that source of life. That does not remove all the curses, all the judgments. They're still there. But it does give us grace to achieve things and to rise above some of the difficulties in ways that others cannot, and in ways that others find impossible to do. So, one of the things that I've been contemplating recently is the whole subject, I suppose it's appropriate with the coronavirus flying around the world, it's the whole subject of how people mourn death of a loved one. In unbelievers' communities, they often do not know how to get above that tragedy and that sadness. And they stay locked into the bitterness of it, or the discouragement of it, the depression of it, and they just don't know how to rise above it because they do not have a hope, either for themselves or for their loved one. Now, there's been a rather sad case recently in England, and in some ways I really don't blame the parents involved. Relatively recently, in the UK there are a number of American air bases, and as you know, America and England drive on opposite sides of the road. And many Americans like to bring over their cars when they're based in a foreign country. So they're driving with a vehicle with a steering wheel on the wrong side. And frequently when they come out of an airbase where they're all driving on the American side, you're right, on the wrong side, I would say, you know, for English roads, they drive out of the airbase and they forget. And so there have been all kinds of near misses and difficulties. And on this one particular occasion, the wife of a military attaché who was attached to an airbase near Northampton in England, she drove out her car and drove down the wrong side of the road and hit a young man on his motor scooter and killed him. And very quickly the Americans shunted him back, her back and her husband back to America. But the parents just don't know how to get over this. Donald Trump has tried to reach out to them and buy their forgiveness, which didn't work. But they are bitter. And of course the media get onto this and always ask for their opinion, which just exaggerates it. And they just end up talking about how, how hurt they are. And you can see they just have not known how to get over this sadness. But as believers, we have a hope, right? And we can have a trust in the goodness of God, and we can lift our eyes above that horizon. And Jesus, to help him, I suppose, and us see death differently, didn't use the word death hardly at all. He said the person's fallen asleep. Even Paul started to use this. So when Jesus was going to raise Lazarus from the dead initially, he said, no, don't worry, he's just asleep. Now, this was not because he was physically asleep. He died. But Jesus, as does the Father, as does the Holy Spirit, sees death as a temporary state that they are master of. And Jesus knew full well this is just for a couple of days, because God's going to get glory bringing him out of the grave, right? So our horizon needs to be different very frequently when it comes to the world in which we live, and especially the difficulties of labor and work. We need to see a different perspective, and we need to engage with a whole different reality. So in our world today, we see all kinds of evidence of the curse on work. Here's a list of just a few of them: child labor, slavery, harsh, unsafe working conditions, gender discrimination, ever-widening gap between rich and poor, unjust labor practice, failure of employers to meet minimum wage standards, employing people who really shouldn't be employed at all, just so that someone can make a bit more money and try and escape some of the challenges that work presents us and that judgment on our work presents. So all of these things come out of the greed of mankind, of trying to avoid really the principle of labor and fair and just reward. And so is it then surprising that not just in other countries but here too, most people don't enjoy their work? When I lived in South Africa a number of years ago, Sunday Times came out with a survey on that and said that 69% of South Africans did not enjoy their work. Recent survey in America, 70% of Americans are not engaged with or actively are disengaged from their work. They do it, in other words, just for the money at the end of the month, and not at all for any other reason. And that is really a sadness, because then there's a very important part of their creativity and their expression and their ingenuity and their effort and their labor which is missing from what they're accomplishing, which is then limited and transactional. And no one works best when it's just a purely transactional relationship. When you know that something is being brought out of you that others are honoring, appreciating, and esteeming, regardless of what they give to you, then it just motivates you so much more to do your best and to do better. So we then come to define people by what they do. This is another consequence of working in a fallen world with work under judgment. We measure people and define people by what they do, not by who they are. So how do banks measure people? If any of us, absolutely. So, my bank, I bank with a particular bank, maybe I shouldn't say, but then they always have, RMB or Investec, or they have an elite bank, don't they? They have the kind of, and then they grade the cards. Are all the cards the same color? All the bank cards and all the credit cards? No, you have silver. That's the bottom rung. Or blue. Or blue. That's it. Then you have silver, and then you have gold, and then you have platinum, right? And then if you earn over 700,000 a year or something, you get promoted into a whole different realm. Then you get ushered into a different building, and you get given coffee with a proper coffee machine, and you don't have to wait in long queues. You can ring up, make an appointment, go in, they usher you in, and because they grade people according to what? How much they earn. So they're measuring people by what they earn. Airlines do the same. It's nice to travel business class, but it costs about £3,500 to get to London. Work that one out. Well, so we live in a world which measures people and defines people by what they do and how much they earn, by the car they drive, by where they live, by the clothes they wear, by what brands they put on. That's how the world measures people. And that's all a consequence of a fallen world and a wrong understanding of the value of work and money. And so we have to uncouple, we have come to uncouple work from God, and then the work becomes the taskmaster. So the moment you bring God back into your work, you're given a grace and a capacity to do it, not just as required, but better than required, with more time, more effort, more emotion, more creativity. The moment you uncouple God, it becomes arduous, it becomes a labor, it becomes a struggle. And God has to help us, therefore, release ourselves from that struggle. Workaholism is another aspect of the tyranny of work, where people feel that they have got to put in the extra hours because they have to define themselves differently in the eyes of others, or the bank because they want to earn that more money, because they want to get to, the platinum credit card, because actually there are more perks. And it's all this striving, all this struggle, all this effort, and so much of it, really, beloved, is a waste, and we can find those things so completely and so fulfillingly in a relationship to God and bringing him back into our working life and world.